Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bill Even, your CEO at the National Pork Board in Des Moines, Iowa. Welcome to this afternoon's discussion around retail and consumer insights due to COVID-19. This webinar here today is designed to really give us a peek beyond what's happening in the immediate farm emergency and understand how consumers are thinking and reacting, and how has the supply chain in the grocery area responded to that. We only produce one product, folks, and that's pork. And everything that we do on the farm, everything we do in the processing plants has to lead to getting a product into the mouth of a consumer somewhere. And that's what today's session is designed to do. If you go to the next slide, we want to make sure everybody's aware the National Pork Board does follow our antitrust laws in the United States under the Sherman Act, and we take these matters very seriously. On the next slide is just a bit of a disclaimer that the views expressed by the invited speakers are theirs and not those of the National Pork Board, which does not advocate, endorse, or suggest any course of conduct or action that may be covered. On the next slide is our contact information. As always, feel free to reach out to us if you've got any questions at all regarding the pork industry or this particular topic. I would note that this webinar is being recorded. You're able to also ask questions in the chat box during the course of the webinar, and we will get those answers to you. In addition, this webinar recording will be placed online at pork.org/COVID-19, so you have access to it later. Encourage you to feel free to share that to anyone that you know in the industry that may find this information valuable and helpful. On the next slide, I'll cover our speakers. So first off, we're pleased to have Anthony Monaco with us today, the National Fresh and Processed Pork Buyer at C&S Wholesale Grocers. Very big operation covering a large part of the eastern United States with some major grocery retailers. And Anthony will be covering off on what he's seeing happening in the supply chain, how that echoes back onto us as pork producers. We also have Tara Dugan. Tara is a Director of Insights and Research at the National Pork Board. She is the person that looks deep into the data and understands consumer sentiment and consumer trends. Tara comes to us formerly from McDonald's. And then Dallas Hockman, the Vice President at the National Pork Producers Council, will be joining us later this afternoon to give an update on what's happening through MPPC. And next slide is essentially the very brief agenda today. There's a lot of substance to it, but retail insights, the consumer insights, and then roll on to MPPC, and then just a couple of closing slides from me. And so with that, I'll advance to the next slide, and I would turn the presentation over to Anthony Monaco with C&S Retail Distributors. Anthony, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak today to an industry that I'm very passionate about, and kind of give an insight of what the, I'd say, last 12 to 14 weeks have brought. So we can go forward to the next slide. So C&S has very strong values, and I can run through these pretty quickly. We play an integral role in serving our community, most important infrastructure. Nourishing our communities, it's more than a job, it's a legacy. We keep our values alive through a culture that embraces differences, promotes innovation, and is focused on giving back. We work as one team, every person matters. We're tenacious in filling our commitments. We challenge the status quo, which the past 12 to 14 weeks, that has been very, very clear. We continuously make our work environment and communities better, and it's these values that transform our daily work into a mission. At C&S Wholesale, we believe that our country can only grow with a solid infrastructure system, providing the basic essentials that are every person's right, which is food, which is really near and dear over the past pandemic, which we are a big piece of putting food on people's tables, and in the middle of the pandemic, trying to figure every way possible to keep the supply chain is unbroken, I guess the word I'll use, is possible. We believe we are a better country, we better people, and a better company, when we help each other, which in the light of today's news is a good statement. Our focus is simple but meaningful. From our distribution centers to our offices, every C&S employees work to help feed our families, neighbors, and our communities. So a lot of powerful stuff there, and a lot of those values have definitely been brought to light throughout the pandemic. So we can switch off to the next slide. C&S, we want to be an employer of choice with a world-class culture that fosters belonging, recognizes uniqueness, empowers all to share their experiences and ideas, and allows each employee to maximize their potential. Being a partner of choice for our customers by driving value, delivering best-in-class solutions, providing operational excellence, and optimizing cost to serve to help our customers grow. Keeping our communities fed by supporting our retail partners across the country and providing community organizations with resources required to ensure that every American has a reliable access to nutritious food. Protect and improve the environment by implementing processes that promote the preservation of the environment, elimination of waste, and reduction of our carbon footprint so we can all enjoy a viable future. The commitment and our legacy at C&S, we work every day to ensure that we continue to build our strong heritage. Just a little bit of the values and kind of what we do and what we believe in as a company. And again, all of that stuff very, very clear the past couple months. We can switch off to the next one. So over the past 4 years, C&S has a very strong partnership with the National Pork Board. We have been attending the Retail Advisory Conference twice a year throughout this. The Pork Board has booths at our local food shows, provides retail cutout charts, POS material, really getting engaged with the customers, talking to them, what do you need, the Hispanic piece of it, supporting all our regions. Training materials, we do a bunch of training sessions with our sales, inside and outside sales team, about pork. We've done pork 101, 102, 103, from farm to table and everything in between, to give the sales staff as much information they need to continue to sell pork. The Pork Board is part of a Dietary All Seasons magazine. It's a digital print. It's distributed nationally, and Pork Board has been a big piece of that. Shared lead generation and contact information for pork retailers. So there is a very strong partnership between C&S and the Pork Board, and we, which brings us here. So we can switch to the next slide. So we got a quick look at the distribution network. So all the states in red are the states we serve. Warehouse, not all warehouse locations, but the states we serve. I thought it was more important to show the touch of where we get food and get pork to those states than the actual warehouses. And then on the right-hand side, we have our top customers, from chains to independent business, with the independent grocers being a very large piece of the business we do serve, and we will get more into the independent challenge that COVID has brought to us so far. So we can switch off to the next slide. All right, now you have the top 10 fresh pork items listed. So those are not in any particular order. Seasonality takes a big piece of that, which would, as we get into the holidays, picnics increase, lines decrease, but generally those are the top fresh pork items, and that's all cryovac. There is a little bit of combo done, but mostly all cryovac, as well as for the processed items, ham, bacon, sausage, deli meat, pork, pizza toppings, and items such as that. So pretty large category, as you can see. Next slide, please. All right, so for the consumer demand for pork over COVID-19 has shown different stages, I guess the word I would say. So we'll start running through some of this, and I have a timeline and a couple stories to share as we get through this on different events that have went through. So the fresh pork demand the initial surge of demand started around that March 14th timeframe and really lasted into the first part of April. And that's where you really saw that retail demand or panic buy-ins, so to speak, begin at that point. So now you have food service closing, and the availability of all these food service specific pork items now all become thrown into the mix. So there's no the fresh primals are very, very low, and you have all these food service items. So there was a lot of trading with food service companies. There was a lot of items being used that generally aren't a retail item, and specifically not a independent retail item. So you had that switch, and then it switched over to demand went from fresh to frozen, and that happened very, very quickly. And freezer levels across the country were cleaned down to about a 2-week supply, and that I would say that would be food service and retail items in that first real wave of demand. So the decrease in demand of production in the void of fresh pork. Once that void was filled, the panic buying, which we looked at as, the panic buying has come to an end, but there was always that conversation of, hey, plants are going to close. I can remember having a lot of, conversations with Deb Belfiore and Lou Piscatano, which I work for. What are we going to do if these plants close? And it wasn't, I don't think we thought it was if, it was more of a when. And I can remember and I say I can remember it, I make it sound like it was so long ago, but with how emotional it's been and the ups and downs, it seems like it was forever ago. I remember waking up on a Saturday at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I remember going downstairs to my computer and putting together these wish lists of orders of meat that I was anticipating all these plants closing, and calling people on Saturday morning, like at 5:30 a.m. my time, waking them up on a Saturday to try to get some purchase orders put out there. And then comes the second surge of demand, and you have plants closing, and the media is fueling this meat shortage. I saw demands as high as 70% increase on some of this stuff, and this fueled the biggest gap with the highest demand and the shortest supply. So I was kind of standing there in the middle of this, and I kind of put it as I was in the middle of a tornado, just trying to get my arms around what is happening and how can I get through this, and frankly, where can I get this product from? So we can switch to the next slide. So I'm going to share a quick story about a date that I will never forget throughout this, and I remember it was Friday, April 17th. I remember I was getting, the plants were closing, the media was coming out, I was getting emails, phone calls, my phone wouldn't stop from customers. Buy everything, plants are closing, buy everything. And I remember I called Debbie that day, and I said to Debbie, I will never forget this day, and someday I will speak about this day. And I was in that tornado where it just felt like the world is crashing. As passionate as I am about this business, so I get to speak about it today, and I will never forget that day. So in the product mix, the demand has been increased equally, really, across all the primals. With boneless loins being one of the top items, the demand was up almost about 4 times. And as tight as boneless loins were, it was just compounding the problem, as the demand, it just keep going up and up and up. We saw a lot more of the the independent retailer. I mean, we really don't have I can't really tell them what to sell and how to sell it. As good relationship I have with them, I have some say, but it's not a chain where I can just dictate, go ahead and do this. So there was a lot of getting creative, and it actually got to the point, if it's pork and we want it, and that's basically where that got. So kind of a couple fallouts of the fresh in the demand. So case ready pork became one of the highest requested items as stores labor is decreasing. And really the only items that had somewhat availability were commodity primals bone in. With the labor issue across the country, there wasn't really any area to be taken on new case ready items. As well as frozen ribs, the demand increased exponentially, with the lack of fresh, and it put a lot more stress on the supply chain and the frozen, that the supply, A, wasn't where it needed to be to begin with, and B, the demand is just completely overtaking that, as retailers want something, and they looked at, let's just get a cheap rib in the case. So frozen ribs was probably the second most demanded item. We could switch off to the next slide, please. Fresh sausage, processed fresh sausage. All the retailers wanted, if I can't have these fresh pork items, then this is the fresh pork I want. Again, completely increased. The boneless fresh pork capacity decreased. It's just a snowball compound of one item to the next item. And then you have the fresh process, the sausage processors calling, C&S, and calling myself and calling other wholesalers asking for help to get raw materials, which, I think we all know what the answer to that was. For the processed demand, items increase: hot dogs, boneless hams, bacons, lunch meats. Again, this all goes back to the boneless meat. So you see a lot of SKU rationalization. We're cutting back to just the main SKUs in that category as well. We could switch to the next slide, please. So kind of just a timeline to just kind of tie in what I just said. So you have, March 14th through April 7th, the demand surges as panic buying sets in, and this continues through the first week of April, really. The weeks of April 12th through the week before Memorial Day, or right around that Memorial Day time, you have the media is fueling this meat surge, and I think the surge was stronger and longer than the original panic buying, because I think the word meat shortage was thrown in there. I remember listening to watching the media and watching the news, and I remember saying to my wife, I've got to go to the store and go buy some meat, because I started, I was watching, seeing this, and concerned about having enough protein for the family. So I did fall into that surge buying. So Memorial Day to current, Memorial Day demand was definitely lower than expected. I know I've seen a lot of reports that Memorial Day sales were higher. So my kind of feeling with that is you have different states opening different times, parts of the economy are opening different, and I believe that the consumers' freezer levels of all this panic bought meat and pandemic bought protein, especially pork, had a piece of the softer business. You're not having large parties, you're having smaller gatherings, if anything, at different households. So I think that had a lot of piece of it too, and definitely the individual economic hit. A lot of people have taken economic hits through this, and I think that had a piece of it. As we get into Memorial Day and the panic buying and stocking up, I think different choices were made for proteins. As the plants are reopening and the harvest is increasing, the demand is decreasing rapidly. Again, I think that all goes back to individual freezer levels, as well as the economic piece of it, and that some people are definitely making other purchase choices when it comes to protein. So we could switch that to the next slide. So some of the challenges that we did see through this is, as the plants closed and the high labor items, became non-available, as the plants were just doing, what they could based off of their labor. We needed to get very creative to touch a large number of independent grocers. And as I've spoke, this becomes a challenge. We don't really have the capacity to dictate, this, and this, for fresh items in the independent grocery stores. So what we did from day one is we put together a twice daily communicator to the stores, and this was all all the information was fed by the national buyers on the proteins, basically calling out, where we are positionally, what you should see for, possibly SKU cuts, kind of plant closings. We kept that kind of as little as possible to, keep from adding to the panic. But the one thing is that we were as transparent from day one to today with the customers as, this is what we have, this is what we told you we thought we could do, this is what we are going to do. So transparency and communication was a big piece of some of the supply chain challenges. We could switch to the next slide. So we have a holiday in the middle of a pandemic. So as we were looking for the owner's manual to how to react to a holiday in a pandemic, which we never found, we had to figure out what the consumer demand is going to be. And after many hours and many conference calls and many chats with people, we really came up with, and this was pre-Easter, this was before we actually found out what the outcome was going to be, is that we came up with the consumer is going to be looking for more of a small boneless item, as the traditional 2, 3, 4 extended family gathering is going to be cut back to possibly smaller family dinners. And it really kind of played out that way at the end of it. The demand for the smaller boneless SKUs exceeded the traditional portion and spiral hams. Although the demand was higher for portion and spiral hams, the boneless hams was higher than that. Sorry. So with nothing to go into this with no direction, product already purchased, product already on the road, it made for, in the middle of a pandemic, it made for a very interesting holiday, but played out exactly as what we came up with. So we can switch off to the next slide. So challenges that we've been through, labor, which I believe everybody has been through labor challenges. The demand's increasing, labor is decreasing. C&S is partnered with many food service companies to keep not only their employees working, but to keep up with the demand and selection, drivers, receivers, warehouse employees, and as well as warehouse space. As we all know, the dynamics of this thing is changing. I would like to say daily, but I think we all know it's multiple times a day sometimes. The partnerships continue to grow with food service companies. The same thing with warehouse capacities. With the surge of business, the warehouse capacities across the country, and I don't just speak for C&S, I speak for anybody in this business, have been stressed across the country. So there's been a lot of measures taken to keep inbound, outbound selection, and keep the supply chain going on that, as well as the partnerships with food service. We can switch to the next slide. So the supply chain disruptions have been a pretty wild ride in fresh pork, from really the initial panic buying to the lulls and everything in between that we've been through at this point. As an industry, we had to adapt very quickly to changes, sometimes many times a day, especially with the largest piece of our business being independent grocers. And one thing we would talk about as this whole thing rolled out is we really had to take all the experience in our organization in the fresh meat, And we kind of had to throw that out and, look at, well, this is how we have to do this now. And some of those were difficult, some of those times, as it's not, you go from doing one thing one way to the next day completely opposite of, cutting orders back and holding stuff back and not quoting ads and pulling ads and, the complete opposite of what we all know in this business. So it was, there was some challenging times behind that. And then chains, generally operate many weeks ahead, and we got kind of caught in ads with that and independent questions of, how can we still have ads when there are no not product, and so a lot of difficult conversation with the customers through this as well. And then again, to call out, that being transparent with our customers is the biggest thing we did. Whether it was good news, bad news, or in between, we talk with our customers daily. A lot of our customers have very strong relationships with us. So transparency was definitely a big piece of COVID-19 up to this point. And I think that's everything at this point. Again, it's been an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to Fresh Pork, and I thank the Pork Board for asking me to be a part of this.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Ann Dugan, and I am the Director of Research and Insights for the National Pork Board. Today, I am going to be talking to you about some consumer insights, really echoing and providing some behind the scenes of the information that we've been seeing, aligning very closely with the trends that Anthony has mentioned. And Anthony, thank you so much for the perspective, as it's really interesting to understand what has been happening as you're closer to the front line with the consumers.
Welcome.
Next slide, please. So I'm going to take us through a little bit of a snapshot, just going through some specific topics related to how consumers are behaving, in addition to some economic factors and how they are thinking about health. So ultimately, as we all know, we're entering into a new stage of COVID-19. Just about most states are reopening, but consumers ultimately expect that the crisis will go on. From a restaurant standpoint, while consumers are very excited for restaurants to reopen, they're still concerned about health and safety risks and a different experience from what they knew. We've got some great partners that we invest our dollars in to understand both retail insights and restaurant insights. And our restaurant insights have shown us exactly what consumers are craving once they're able to get back to those dining out behaviors. But nonetheless, skepticism exists. From an alternative channel standpoint, with that said, delivery, takeout, and direct-to-consumer meat services have seen some growth, and these are ultimately helping to mitigate some of the exposure, at least from the restaurant side of the business. But when we think from a macro standpoint, unlike the past recessions, consumers are balancing both financial concerns and health and safety concerns, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. And many are ultimately bracing for long-term economic challenges. So some of the things that we anticipate consumers will do is that they will reduce their spend, but food is one of those areas where we've been a bit shielded, and specifically meat. That may change. We also see that consumers are settling into a new normal. They've been exhibiting different meat purchase behaviors, and they've also had different at-home cooking routines. So to Anthony's point, we've seen lots of different cuts across the hog see growth, and that's been a positive story. It's been a bright spot in all of this, and we'll continue to monitor against that, but we are starting to see some shifts in how consumers are spending, which we'll talk about. And then lastly, I'll just touch on it for a second around immune health. So consumers have indicated that they are looking for more immune boosting foods. There are a couple of different factors that we're seeing. Some is that they just want to feel that the food that they're eating is safe, but then otherwise they also want to feel that they are putting food into their body that they can feel good about. To a degree, what we're seeing is that there's a small, passionate minority who feels that this is a perfect opportunity for them to shift over to vegan and plant-based behavior, but ultimately it's still small, it's under 3%. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're entering into this new stage. When we look at the chart on the left, what we're looking at is how many weeks do consumers predict it will take before life gets back to normal. And you can see that from that initial bar, which was roughly 2 weeks after the pandemic period started, consumers roughly anticipated that it would be about 3 months. Now, as we get further along, they're expecting that it'll be at least 6 months. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that some of the recent activities may cause some of these concerns and contention to expand even longer. But nonetheless, when we look at the information on the right, we see that through this period, which was through May 22nd, roughly 2 weeks ago, consumers were still pretty concerned. The green and the orange represent folks who thought that most COVID-19 restrictions should be removed, or that they were ready for all restrictions to be relaxed, whereas the remainder represents folks that were still pretty darn concerned. And ultimately, regardless of any metric that you look at, there's about 50 to 60% of consumers who are still acting in a bit of reluctance with everything that's going on. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, consumers are balancing those financial and health and safety concerns. So we see on the left the share of respondents by expected duration of the crisis. And the dark blue bars represent health crisis, and the lighter blue bars represent economic crisis. So ultimately, what we're seeing is that consumers anticipate that the economic impact is going to outlast the health and safety risk. However, looking on the right side, we see that 60% of them note that they're more concerned about the virus itself than the market impact. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which as a consumer geek, we've been talking about it a lot, consumers are looking to meet some of those very bare minimum requirements and those very bare minimum needs. And when they're dealing with both health and safety concerns, what matters the most to them is that they're able to maintain a safe life for themselves and their family, but they're also unfortunately balancing the fact that there are a lot of different things going on financially as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to camp out here for a second. This information is information that National Pork Board is collecting on a weekly basis with our partner PSB, who focuses on brand and reputation management in addition to crisis management. This is a research tracker that we collect amongst 1,000 consumers on a weekly basis, where we're able to understand metrics such as favorability toward pork, likelihood to purchase, how confident they feel in the pork sold, whether or not they've recently heard anything connected with meat or pork, and then also some industry factors such as whether or not they believe that the pork industry provides a safe environment for employees and the like. There's a lot more where this came from, but we've been using this information to assist with our messaging and also to assist with our industry partners in providing additional information to help support decisions during this very tumultuous and uncertain time. The good news is that regardless of the metric that we're looking at, pork is favoring very highly. So I'll point to the number that's in the table on the left-hand side towards the bottom, recently read or heard about COVID-19 in connection with. What this indicates to us is about 50% of people in this period, which was through May 25th, had recently heard something about pork in the news, and 70% had recently heard something about meat in the news. And these were all in the context of COVID. So ultimately, in spite of the fact that consumers are largely aware of the issues that we're facing in the industry, from plant closures to meat shortages, depopulation, and the like, they're still relatively favorable for pork and for meat. So any of the metrics that we look across the slide, 88% are very or somewhat favorable. 80% are very likely or somewhat likely to purchase in the future. 92% strongly agree that they feel confident in eating the pork sold in the US. These are all strong numbers. With that said, we still want to understand what the concerns are, because if you peel back and if you, like me, look at any of the social media articles or media news stories that land themselves on social media, and you read the comments, then you might get a different view. And this is one of the reasons that we really prioritize leaning into the data to understand, because it is easy to take away certain points and not others without looking at the whole picture of how it represents the entire consumer body. And ultimately, what we found is that the biggest concern amongst consumers right now is the health and safety of employees working at packing plants. So peeling that back, some of it is that, yes, indeed, they are concerned about possible potential outbreaks in the communities of those particular workers, but they're also humanely very concerned about the employees themselves. So with that said, there's not enough that the industry can continue to say about what's being done to ensure employee and plant worker safety and farmer safety as well. Next slide, please. So just to summarize a couple of points, meat and pork, as Anthony mentioned, are both still growing, and dynamics are starting to shift. So in the economy, generally speaking, we've talked about those financial concerns. Millennials have been hit really, really hard. 40% have lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19 or had their hours reduced. And shoppers under the age of 35 generally were not purchasing as much meat as their boomer and Gen X counterparts before, but they definitely had started to during this pandemic period. So on the bright side, we are seeing that pork is in the household and on hand more than it normally is, which is great. And there's a lot of information, especially being produced by the MPB domestic marketing team, to help consumers while they have pork on hand. But nonetheless, we've got 40 million people across the entire country who have recently filed for unemployment. And certainly they're going to have to start making different and difficult decisions over time. On a bright note, from a social standpoint, coming off Memorial Day, pork Google search was dominated by grilling and meat smoking. So even though people had a lot of meat on hand and they likely tapped into it, pork was on the grill, they were also searching and Googling to understand how to prepare meat. And that's ultimately what we've seen. We've seen that when there's news articles and stories, they're digging in, they're curious about themes of workers and plant closures and meat shortages and whatnot. But when it comes to preparing a meal, they're right back to those behaviors of looking for recipes to enjoy pork. And when it comes to actual meat on hand and what they've experienced in store, through our tracker, what we've been able to understand is about 27% of consumers report out of stocks on fresh pork when they shop. This is down from 3 weeks ago, actually, now, and consistent with last week. That's information that's hot off the press. Now, just to recap on the industry trust and awareness piece, awareness of both meat and pork in the news is ultimately holding steady and pretty widely known. Nonetheless, favorability, confidence in U.S. pork, and trust in the industry to produce safe food and provide a safe environment for employees has seen strong performance. When we ask consumers where the responsibility lands, they ultimately feel that for plant employees, plant executives and managers should shoulder most of the blame. So this is something that, again, the industry definitely needs to keep in mind when communicating outwardly to consumers. At the end of the day, though, 3/4 of consumers believe that COVID-19 has revealed fundamental flaws in the overall food supply chain. This in and of itself opens itself up to opportunities for us in the future. Now, before we transition to the last slide that we'll discuss, I do want to talk a bit about what we're seeing in total US sales. So in the center of the slide, we've got a couple of bar charts that represent 4-week growth in dollars in volume, in addition to 1-week change in dollars in volume. And on the left side, you see that the blue bars indicate fresh pork's growth. The orange bars represent bacon, and then the red represents all meat. So in this 4-week period ending May 16, 2020, we saw that pork's growth, fresh pork's growth, was outpacing the total category. And penetration, or household penetration, which is the percent of households buying, was a part of that. But not only that, people were spending more. And we know that pork is very valuable to retailers. As a matter of fact, the baskets that have pork in them tend to be more valuable than baskets that have other proteins alone. On the right side, however, we see that some of those sales that we've seen, some of that growth is starting to erode just a bit. It's not quite as high as it was over the trended period. And there could be a combination of reasons for this. One is that, as indicated underneath the charts, prices are changing. Consumers are also being limited by the number of purchases that they're able to make against meat, in spite of the fact that those shortages, particularly for pork, are better than they were before. In addition, as Anthony mentioned, some consumers do have meat that's already on hand. So all of these things combined, not to mention the fact that some of the restaurants are starting to open back up, all of these things combined indicate that the dynamics are shifting a bit. Nonetheless, we're doing a lot of work with consumers and with marketing to make sure that we're tapping into these behaviors of having fresh pork on hand to ensure that consumers continue to enjoy it, and that we can do our best to help to sustain some of the demand that we've seen during this pandemic period. Moving to the next slide. So ultimately, I'll just close on this. Behaviors are continuously evolving. And Anthony, I have to say that I also took part in all of this. I was a part of the surge behavior. I went out and bought a deep freezer as well because I wanted to make sure I had enough meat on hand. And there's a lot of consumers that are in the camp. Some folks ask me what I'm surprised by when it comes to consumers. And one of the things I've been most surprised by is the out of stocks that exist, not in food, but in other categories. But thinking about food, a few factors. Consumers are planning to continue home cooked meals more than likely, especially given the fact that many of them continue to believe that the pandemic period, or at least the health crisis, will continue. This is not to say that folks aren't a bit exhausted with cooking in the kitchen, but they're also enjoying the time with family, and they have a need to stretch their dollars. The idea of meals may be shifting. So whereas before consumers were really looking for meal solutions, now to a degree it appears that they're going back to a more balanced approach, a balanced approach that includes a center of plate meat and then also vegetables on the side. We're continuing to keep a pulse on both consumer and shopper behavior so that we can understand these trends and ultimately message to consumers and to assist our partners in the industry accordingly. No one has a crystal ball in all of this, but what we might anticipate coming out of it is that convenience will look different. And that's whether you're at retail or at food service. And the way that consumers go to market and have different needs will look very different on the other side of this. But in all of it, we'll continue to monitor and to track. And we thank you for the time today. With that, I will go ahead and I will turn it on over to Dallas to make some comments on behalf of MPPC.
Thank you, Tara. And thanks everyone for joining today to hear about the industry updates from your checkoff dollars at work, as well as your strategic investment dollars with MPPC. As everyone should know, MPPC is the America's pork producers' voice for legislative, regulatory, and trade issues. I want to thank all of you who are SIP members and let you know that we're very busy during these trying times and representing your interests. I wanted to just give you a couple updates today. COVID-related challenges have taken a severe financial and emotional toll on our producers. And rapid federal government assistance is needed to help thousands of pork producers weather this crisis. National Pork Producers Council is asking the U.S. Senate to expeditiously adopt livestock agriculture provisions that was just approved in the House of Representatives. As you all know, the impact of COVID has caused hog values to plummet, creating financial disaster for pork producers nationwide, as well as the terrible decision in some cases to potentially have to euthanize pigs backed up on farms due to ongoing bottlenecks in our supply chain. Livestock agriculture provisions included in the House-passed HEROES Act would provide much needed relief measures for the U.S. pork producers. Our priority right now is urging the Senate to quickly adopt these provisions in the companion legislation that they might pass. We recognize not all of these pieces in the HEROES Act will get passed, but we're aggressively asking for consideration for pork producers. These are in the 4 areas. One is compensation for euthanized livestock that can't be processed into food supply. Expanded direct payments without payment limitations to livestock farmers who have suffered severe losses due to the COVID-related market disruption. Increased funding for animal health surveillance and laboratories, which have been tapped to perform COVID testing during this human health emergency. And lastly, not talked a lot about, but very important, mental health assistance for our farmers who face an unimaginable animal welfare crisis. In addition, last week, the House overwhelmingly approved H.R. 7010, which would provide businesses such as yourself with greater flexibility in how to use the Paycheck Protection Program funds, as well as have their loans forgiven. This new legislation would expand the amount of time you will have to spend the money from 8 to 24 weeks, eliminate the requirement that businesses need to spend at least 75% of the funds on payroll if they want the full loan amount to be forgiven, extend the time period to rehire employees from June 30th, 2020 to December 31st, 2020, and eliminate all rehiring requirements. We hope, and we're lobbying heavily, but that the Senate will approve this. So those are the 2 things we're looking for, that as we hear from producers, most importantly right now is the need for financial help in the form of direct payments, as well as help in offsetting the costs due to euthanasia. There's a lot of positive things that were talked about today in the previous speakers, and what Tara just talked about hopefully will have some long-lasting effects for us as we come out of this crisis. It's a great opportunity for rediscovering pork and its great value there. But at the same time, we're facing some real serious challenges. And one of those, as we all recognize, and Pork Board is providing some great resources, and I'm sure Bill will hit on these, for those producers who have to have the unimaginable challenge of euthanizing animals. In the event that you're faced with that, I just encourage you to make sure you're working with your veterinarian, keeping good records of which Pork Board has them available. But we also, at this time frame, sadly, are dealing with activist groups who are attacking our industry and using this opportunity to create a lot of noise relating to the euthanization process. So we just encourage you, if you are dealing with the terrible decision to have to euthanize animals, that you just secure all your sites and ensure that your animals and your workers are safe. You remain vigilant in suspicious activity and communicate with law officials, enforcement in your area, and inspect your sites and make sure that there's no suspicious activity. Check for, we've seen them putting in electronics or recording devices. And so I just encourage the people to be aware of that, because at this time frame, due to the awareness of this challenge that is going on, we do see some activists at work. So if you have any questions on that, don't hesitate to reach out to your state pork association office or the National Pork Board office or NPPC on any further clarifications or help in that. So we thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to Pork Board for allowing us a few minutes to kind of update you on what's taking place with NPPC. And with that, Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you for conclusion of the call.
Thanks very much, Dallas. And I I've got Anthony still on the line here. I don't know if most people understand the level that Anthony's playing at. I think if you looked at the map of what C&S covers in the United States, they pretty much ring the perimeter of the country where hundreds of millions of people live. And I wanted to take advantage of asking him a couple quick questions. And so, Anthony, are you still on the line?
Yes, Bill, I'm here.
Perfect. So when you look at the vantage point that you're at with C&S Wholesale, and I'd like to ask you a couple questions. Number one, you've just gone through the battle, but where do you see the long range trends around meat and pork in particular as we come out of COVID-19? Where do you see your business and more importantly your grocery customers landing a year from now?
It's a good question, Bill. So we're currently trying to work out, what's the new business? What is COVID, where we are today forward look like with, you have less food service open, some reports I've seen, people aren't in a rush to get back to restaurants. So, is the meals at home going to continue, and how long does it continue? So we're kind of still working through all of that right now, to see where this is going to land. I mean, my immediate thought is there's going to be some sort of increase in percentage based off of the food service piece of it. But, I don't really think anybody has the answer to that fully at this point.
All right, so you're trying to look at a cloudy crystal ball pretty much the way the rest of us are.
Well,
one issue that's really plagued the industry, Anthony, is labor shortages. And we've seen it on farms, we've seen it in plants, we've seen it in the trucking industry, and we've seen it in the grocery. But the outflow of that is these packing plants are slowly limping back to normal. We're still probably running in that, 18-20% idle right now in the United States. And with the shortage of labor, there's a lot of bone-in product hitting the market. How is that looking in your product mix? What are the grocer customers telling you? How are they trying to move that bone-in product? Just a simple fact that there's not enough labor available to do the further processing.
Yeah, I think that kind of, goes with the previous question. So even at the retail level, trying to figure out, what's, and I hate to use this term, but what's the new normal look like? And as their labor is getting back, and as their labor is getting back, we're all trying to figure this out at the same time. I think it's going to get to a point where, not that that's what they have to do, but I think there's going to have to be some direction where, item A, B, and C that's not available now. We need to look at, on the bone-in commodity specific items. And I think there's going to be a switch from the traditional boneless loin, ads to a more of a bone-in commodity item as they work through it themselves on their side, as labor has been a challenge from top to bottom.
So another question I've got here is, while you don't serve the food service industry, the restaurant industry directly, where do you see that landing in the long run? You mentioned the rapid shift in trying to get the right product mix into retail coming out of food service. You're signaling that you expect that food service opening is going to continue to be delayed when you look at Tara's data. If you're given the over-under between now and the end of the year, where do you see the food service industry at? Are they going to be at 50% by the end of the year? What's your sense of that in the industry?
So I think as the states open and as some restrictions are lifted, I mean, a lot is going to come into it is if the smaller restaurants can sustain with all the restrictions, I think some of them are going to go away on their own. I think, if I read some report from FMI, I think it was, that they're looking at a 2 to 3 year curve back to where the restaurants were where we are today. So I think I would probably go at by the end of the year 50, 60%. As to who's not reopening and who can't just physically have the restrictions and still be able to sustain. Um, I would say 50 to 60% by year end. Yeah, I would agree with that.
How about on the labor piece? What's the trucking and delivery and logistics look like for you? What are some hurdles you've had to deal with there?
So I think when it comes to labor, as we've all had hurdles, as we partnered with many food service companies, kind of filled in that gap for us with trucking, selectors, receivers. I think the big picture is as food service starts opening, if it continues to open at that 50 to 60% range, then that difference in labor will still be available through partnerships. I think a lot of it has to do with how fast and how long it takes to get back to pre-COVID restaurant levels.
So how about when you really look at featuring? When one thing that we've noticed is advertising and featuring really dropped away during the middle of the panic that everybody was trying to deal with. What do you see that wholesalers like yourselves doing to continue that product movement now as we get to some semblance of normal? Do you see the retailers needing to do quite a bit of featuring to get consumers back in the store? How's that look to you?
So the retailers are definitely ready to start promoting again, which they have been since I'd say the second week of this. So I would say by Father's Day forward, we should start seeing pretty significant ads going back out there, as a lot of retailers pulled ads, in-store specials and stuff like that, just because of the unknowns of availability. But I would say from Father's Day forward, we should start seeing full ads, and then into 4th of July as well. I think that'll be a breaking point at 4th of July with ads.
Okay. Well, kind of along those lines, do you see some of these products that consumers either have demanded or frankly are now quote unquote, stuck with because that's what's available? Do you see any of those products remaining permanent? In other words, this is maybe a question about what's this product mix going to look like 6 months from now? Does it go back to where we were a year ago, or are there some fundamental shifts in product selection and mix that you see consumers wanting to stick with?
I think there's a little bit of a learning curve in there, I think, and to see what, I think some of the items will stick. I think so, and I think some of the items won't. To your point, it got to a if it's pork, I want it. So yeah, I do think some of it will stay, and I think it's a learning curve for everybody involved at this point as to what the next 6 months look like, as the past couple months it's been changing by the hour.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that, and as we round out the hour here, I just wanted to make sure, Anthony, that I thanked you for taking some time out of your incredibly busy national schedule to speak with us today. Tara Ann, thank you for giving us a little peek under the hood of what the checkoff has for data. And then Dallas as well, for letting all the folks know what you're working on hard in Washington on behalf of the producers. And on this slide here that you see, folks, there's some new swine disposal checklist on the pork.org page. Make sure you're looking at that. And on the next slide, we wanted to let the attendees know that we do have one final webinar that we're looking to present, and it's going to be next week, Tuesday, June 9th. We're going to have speakers from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, so it's the CDC, and Dr. Lisa Beckton, one of our veterinarians here at the National Pork Board. I think you're going to want to tune into this, folks, and let other people know the CDC has been smack dab in the middle of a lot of this conversation around plant operations and public health, and we want to understand what does that look like now down at our farm level. And so please mark this on your calendar and watch your email for an announcement. And with that, that concludes our webinar today. Thanks, and everyone, please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thanks, Bill. Bye.
Goodbye.
Well,